All right, let's get started. I'm Charles Corsmo. I'm a professor at the law school here. I teach primarily corporate law stuff, corporate law, M&A, corporate finance, and I will be moderating this panel. Although I subscribe to the notion that moderator moderates best, that moderates least. So I'm not going to be trying to step on the toes of the panelists, other than to introduce them. We have three terrific panelists with us. A law professor, an economist, and a sociologist, which sounds like the beginning of a joke, but not a very good joke, but a joke. But it's not a joke. They're all wonderful, and we're happy to have them here. And they're going to be talking about lawyers, managers, and bureaucrats, interdisciplinary perspectives on governance. In particular, they're going to be talking to us and to each other, I hope, about whether we need to move beyond sort of the classical transaction cost approach to thinking about contracting in terms of understanding modern manufacturing industries and contracting in those industries. And we're going to start with Professor Lisa Bernstein, who's the Wilson Dickinson Professor of Law at the University of Chicago, and is a distinguished, eminent scholar of contract and commercial laws, taught at top schools all over the country and indeed all over the world, and has a degree in economics from the University of Chicago and her JD from Harvard. And she'll be starting. And then I believe, oh, Josh, are you going next then? We have Professor Josh Whitford from the Department of Sociology at Columbia University. He's a leading scholar of the social, political, and institutional implications of outsourcing in the manufacturing industries, and an alum both as an undergraduate and as a PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. We have a fellow Wisconsinite here, so that's nice. And then we have Professor Susan Helper, the Frank Tracy Carlton Professor of Economics at our very own Case Western Weatherhead School of Management. That rather striking building you might have seen across the alley on the way in. And Professor Helper was formerly chief economist at the Department of Commerce and also served in the White House, and is an influential scholar of global supply chains, an Oberlin undergrad, and a PhD in economics from Harvard. So I will turn it over first to Professor Bernstein. I hope you can hear us there.
Okay, thank you. I want to begin just by welcoming you to this panel, one that I hope will lead to a really interesting discussion both among the panelists and between the panelists and the audience. I should say it's a special pleasure to be on a panel with Sue and Josh, two people who I consider my teachers and in many respects my muses. So as Charlie alluded to, during the course of this panel and our sort of remarks to you, each of us is going to present a perspective that squarely puts on the table something that's really been implicit in a lot of writing on contract. And that is that while transactions cost economics, TCE, has yielded tremendous insight and is really likely to continue to yield insight, we really do need other perspectives brought to the table. If we want to understand the governance choices that face contracting parties, especially in the types of transactions that we've gathered to study here today. Now, none of us are young, and so we're not standing here and we're not going to say, we're going to show you that transactions cost economics is wrong. We're just going to make the point that it's not fully up to the task of identifying the core problems we need to solve or explaining the contracting choices either that parties do make or that they might make. And Williamson in his later years would not probably have been too offended by this, because when he wrote one of his later essays with Steve Tidelis, he emphasized that TCE was not an all-purpose theory of firms and market organization, and expressed this view that pluralism was needed. So it's in that spirit, and in the spirit of Juliet's paper, which brings to the fore and emphasizes the importance of discriminating alignment theory, that we're going to offer our remarks. And taken together, I think it's fair to say they can be seen as a call to move beyond seeing the transaction as the only relevant unit for analysis, and a call to sort of push the notion of discriminating alignment even further and to new ends. I think that speaking from each of our individual perspectives, each of us will also suggest additional aspects of the transactional setting that can be usefully taken into account to improve contract governance, whether it's through better drafting, which might in fact be the least important, better partner choice, or better contract management. So now on sort of to my contribution to the extent it can be labeled as such. Now, as is obvious from Charlie's introduction and the title of this panel, I was invited here in my capacity as a lawyer. Yet, I am going to defect, and what I'm going to suggest to you is that improvements in manufacturing contracts and biopharma alliances, what we're here today to focus on, I don't think the improvements are very likely to come from law. I think law is kind of dead when it comes to these improvements. Rather, I think that if we really want to figure out what's standing in the way of realizing transactional value when we get sort of to boots on the ground, if we want to come up with workable solutions to these problems, or maybe just recognize that, there are some things that neither contract nor relational contract can do. And in those areas, if those things are important to a transaction, it might just be that we have to match with a partner who already has the desired characteristic, because bringing it sort of to be by contract just is a fool's errand. It can never work. So to me, I think if we're going to make progress, we have to go into the domains of Josh and Sue, management and economic sociology. But before lawyers can even open their minds to what these disciplines have to offer, and I really do think that they should, lawyers are going to have to make a very fundamental change in the way that they view transactions. They're going to have to move from seeing contracting parties as unitary entities, an it commanded by, some entrepreneur with ultimate powers of fiat. And they're going to have to grapple with the messy reality, and it is indeed extremely messy reality, that while contracts may be entered into by entities, they're performed by human beings who are embedded in complex organizations that are riddled with agency costs, organizations whose formal rules and informal structures, whose norms and culture and all these other things are going to influence the extent to which the entity subject to the contract chooses to perform, to shade, or to breach its commitments. It's also going to very strongly affect the ability of the contracting counterparty to collaborate when collaboration is called for. So to me, this raises the question that I want to address in the remainder of my remarks. Namely, how can we open up that black box of the firm, that big, messy black box, in a systematic enough way that lawyers will be able to do their jobs more effectively? That is, how can we do it in a way that will increase the likelihood that lawyers will bring their talents to bear in a way that they don't only close deals, but are also able to provide the governance and managerial infrastructure for implementing deals, because there really isn't much point to a deal that only creates value on a piece of paper. Just to take a first cut that I hope will provide maybe just some vocabulary for discussion this afternoon, one way to do this, and a way that I think opens the door nicely to incorporating aspects of management and aspects of sociology, is to borrow, and this is just, like a peanut butter cup, you put your peanut butter and chocolate together, the organizational process view of internal firm management that was developed by John Van Meenen and some of his collaborators at MIT. And then to think about how this perspective can be adapted and then applied to cross-firm contracting. Adapted in a way that will, to begin with, help firms really get a feel for whether they are ready to enter into particular types of deals. Of course, firms spend hundreds of thousands of dollars evaluating their potential supply partners, but they don't really spend an equivalent amount of time evaluating themselves, and I think they should. And of course, this framework can also be used to evaluate the other guy, which is probably where it will first be implemented. So the goal, again, is to think about how to draft contracts that can actually be implemented. And the organizational process view gives us three different pairs of glasses, three different lenses, okay, for thinking about the issues within a firm that might affect contracting across firms. Now, I will describe them in a distinct way, but just to be clear, there are not bright line demarcations between them. So the three lenses are first the strategic design lens, second the political lens, and the third is the cultural lens. So I think it's useful to just take a quick look at each of them. So the strategic design lens is the lens that will probably feel most intuitive to the lawyers in the room. It focuses on aspects of the firm's formal design, things that are done deliberately. It sees organizations as sort of complex systems that some rational mind designs with a strategic goal in mind. It focuses on incentives, on policies, on information systems, role definition, and on the allocation of resources to ensure that whoever is tasked with doing something has the means of doing it. So that's the strategic design lens. The second lens is the political lens, a little bit seeing, loosely speaking, seeing a firm like Congress. It's an arena for competition. There are groups that want this and groups that want that. There are all sorts of different interests running around. The political lens emphasizes that these sort of social networks within the firm can tell you a lot about where power is located. If you're going to do a deal, who has to be on board if that deal is going to have the most remote chance of actually working? Conversely, who, for whatever reason that might be in their own mind, can stop that deal if that's what they want to do. And it emphasizes the importance of taking this into account and realizing, in a way, that agency costs really matter, and the interests of different groups may be very different from the interest of the organization as a sort of unitary entity. Now, the third lens is maybe the most intuitive, but also the most impossible to define. It's the cultural lens. As I work through what this means, I don't come up with a definition of culture that everyone will accept. That's a fool's errand. Rather, I try to think about how particular elements of a firm's culture and its relational contracts might influence how it behaves, both internally and to its contractual counterparts. Now, this is sort of pie in the sky. So I thought what I would do is sort of mention a couple of studies in the hope of making it more concrete that these aspects of a firm's organization are in fact likely to influence its contracting behavior. So for this, I'm going to turn to studies from the management literature and start with the strategic design lens and thinking about it in the context of strategic alliances. So this afternoon, I think we're going to hear a lot about how lawyers who work on these deals focus on honing the terms of the deals. We already heard about that this morning. But it turns out that when you're talking about alliances, the internal organization, the structure of each of the parties also has been shown to have a very strong influence on the likelihood that the alliance will succeed. So a very, very famous study by Dyer, Kale, and Singh found that if the parties had a dedicated alliance management function, then the alliance would achieve a 25% higher long-term success rate than comparable alliances without that function. And when alliances of this type, or alliances with firms of this type more accurately, were announced, they generated almost 4 times the market wealth than transactions where these functions were not present in the firms. In light of this, a lawyer drafting an alliance agreement should certainly take into account whether or not such a function is present. The lawyer should think about why alliance management might be so value generating, so that if it is not there, they can include a contract provision that can help replicate some of the benefits that these types of functions create. So the lawyer might put in lead contract managers who are going to meet on a regular basis to undertake particular tasks, maybe coordinating performance or resolving problems. They might put in place various types of cross-functional teams and things like this, depending on where exactly they see the locus of value here. Okay, what other aspects of strategic design might really bear on what we're talking about here? Well, there are a large number of studies which show that the internal firm management practices that one or both parties use affect the way these transactions work. In particular, a firm's ability to absorb information, its absorptive capacity, that is, its ability to take in information and innovate, is very closely tied to the presence or absence of certain internal managerial practices. So going back again to the management literature, we see a study by Lawrenson and Foss, which shows that a receiving firm's innovativeness turns on its adoption of particular subsets of 9 human resource management practices. And the study is really interesting for what Juliet is going to discuss this afternoon, because it documents that the particular subsets of practices that matter the most were very different depending on the business sector where the firm was located. So in a similar vein, and continuing on this work, Foss and a different set of co-authors found that the link from outside knowledge to innovation is completely mediated by organizational practices, particularly those practices that are related to communication within the firm, the extent to which a firm compensates employees for generating and sharing knowledge, and the extent to which the firm delegates important decision rights to the relevant employees. Now, these contracting practices, you can take them sort of as a given, but it's important to note that many of them can be altered by contract. In fact, a recent paper by myself and my co-author Brad Peterson from Mayo Brown went through and documented just how common it is for buyers to impose some of these very practices on their suppliers via contract. So let's look at the political lens, probably, as I said, the most intuitive. I want to turn here to a study by Keller and his co-authors, or her co-authors, that looked at how a well-functioning alliance between a biotech firm and big pharma in the veterinary medicine sector was disrupted when the big pharma underwent an internal restructuring. Now, the restructuring did change the locus of the responsibility for managing the alliance. It went from the business development group, which had negotiated the deal, to the R&D group. But it's notable. This change left the written terms of the alliance agreement untouched. and there wasn't any argument that its terms had been breached. Yet, shifting the locus of responsibility changed everything. It changed the people who are managing the relationship, and it changed the incentives and worldview of the people managing the relationship, and it basically led to deterioration. Why was this? Well, the original managers felt they'd gone out and found this wonderful outside group to help the firm. This was a mark of their success. So they wanted this thing to succeed. They found the partner. On the other hand, the R&D people internal to the organization felt that the external R&D people were competitors, and that their success would make them look bad if the outsider went faster or did it better or got quicker to market. And so they then decided to slow walk everything about the alliance. Now, had the political element been understood, okay, this consideration could have been taken into account during the restructuring and the problem avoided. So it is really, really important, okay, to keep these things front and center. Now, the importance of the political lens also comes into focus when you really focus on contracts that involve information sharing, whether it's information sharing that's going to lead to innovation or information sharing that's going to lead to cost savings. Why? Well, the literature really makes clear that while it is important to know what information is going to be shared, it may be even more important to know with whom exactly it's going to be shared, because who the receiving person is in the receiving firm and where that person is located in the internal social network of the firm is going to have a big effect on the likelihood that innovation will result. Now, once lawyers know this, it's pretty easy. You can put in a name or a role or something to make sure that this is taken into account. Now, let's think for a moment about something we're going to talk about this afternoon. Let's suppose that we have a lawyer who is structuring a deal, and he becomes aware that for this deal to work, 3 people from 3 different divisions in the counterparty are going to have to work together. And then the lawyer learns that these people don't regularly work together, and for some reason they may not really want to work together. That is, they really begin to understand that information doesn't usually flow between these divisions, and that the parties in them don't necessarily work together. So what might they do? Well, one thing they might do, and I know we'll focus on this later, is form a joint governance committee to help resolve problems that might arise and to govern the transaction. Now, what good is the political lens in the design of a joint governance committee? Okay, well, one of the things is it says when you're making a joint governance committee, yes, it's important to choose people who can make good decisions, but it might also be important to choose people who can help any decisions that are made be implemented more effectively. So in this example, you might want a representative from each of the 3 divisions who's respected within each of the 3 divisions to come to the Joint Governance Committee, discuss what information has to be shared, how the parties are going to work together, and then each of those people will be tasked with taking it back to their cluster to sort of sell it. So when you turn the political lens and you realize that decisions that are taken by the committee have to be sold within 2 different complex organizations, who you put on the committee might be very different if you take these sorts of things into account. Now, The final lens is the cultural lens. And as I said, it's very difficult to define, but it's no less important because of these sorts of difficulties. In fact, it is incredibly important because it is very hard to change aspects of a counterparty's culture. Now, around the margins, and in some ways, it has certainly been done. But if you're going to do this, it's at least important to know you are facing a very uphill battle. And cultural considerations can be strong. They can derail even transactions that look picture perfect on paper. So I'll give you just one quick example. There was a very famous alliance, the subject of a HPR case, between Suzuki and Volkswagen. And it was directed at co-developing and distributing inexpensive cars in the Indian market. And this deal got, no deal I've ever seen got pressed like this. Synergy, 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 the most wonderful thing. Okay, but it didn't really work. Why not? Well, there were problems in its strategic design, the way the exchange of equity was structured. There were all sorts of political issues that tanked the deal, like not including the head of Suzuki India in any of the alliance discussions. And there were important overlooked cultural considerations. One of them was that German engineers take pride in German engineering, and they really didn't want to take part or be associated with the task at hand, which was producing cheaper cars with inferior materials. And they really did not want to be cooperative with Suzuki's Indian engineers. Another cultural problem that caused a real difficulty here is that Volkswagen's internal culture didn't encourage the free flow of ideas and information across divisions of Volkswagen. So if you take a firm whose employees don't want to share with each other within the firm and then say, hey guys, you got to do it across the firm, that's not going to work out too well. So culture there played a huge role in tanking the deal. Now, with all of these examples on the table, what I really do want to suggest is that this framework, this organizational process view, can help lawyers do two things that lawyers should do and that clients should do. The first is to do a contractual pre-mortem, which is where you sit and you say to yourself, okay, if we're sitting here a year from now and this deal is tanked, why do we think this would be? It's a way of focusing on what might go wrong, but not by looking at the ends, but by looking at the causes. And it can also be used to engage in transactional autopsies that can help lawyers learn about what did and didn't work. So while I think this is powerful, I have to end, though, with a real note of caution. And that is, it is important to take these things into account. And we might easily, or with relative ease, develop contract provisions that on their face can appear to do so. But the managerial literature shows that it isn't all that easy to change an organization, okay? There's a lot of resistance to change along numerous dimensions, okay, within complex organizations. So there's promise, but there's also a need to be very cautious. And as I turn things over now to my colleagues, Josh and Sue, I just want to put on the table a question from my current research that the three of us have been discussing so that we can draw all of you into the conversation. And the idea is that maybe, I hate to use words like this, but the nature of contract and what it's supposed to do and how we think about it might really have changed, at least with respect to important sets of contractual provisions. And the idea is that in these manufacturing contracts that have joint innovation in alliance agreements, a large part of what is or should be in a contract is really more akin to a project management plan than it is to the sorts of things I was taught about in law school, where Mr. A promises to deliver widgets to Mr. B of a particular type and description, and the widgets are received and they're either accepted or rejected, and so on and so forth, all the things that we study. And the difference really matters because in project plans, the ability to manage change is a critical feature, where in a contract, it's kind of a bug. Like contract lawyers want to get the thing their client is contracting for. But if the thing is not there and capable of definition, we may have to really take a step back and think about contracts as project plans, which would dictate using managerial tools that have been used for generations when these same types of things were done within firms, across firms in a much more robust way than we currently do. So with that, I want to turn it over to Sue and Josh, representing the disciplines that I think hold the key to the magic kingdom of contract. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Is this on? Okay. I believe, yes, my slides are going up, and I hopefully have some means of changing them. Does that keyboard allow me to change them? Yes, okay.
Yes, it does.
Okay, it's great to be here. As has been said multiple times, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a sociologist, but also I should say something about the people in the room in this panel. So the last time I was at Case Western, I was in graduate school doing the project that became the dissertation that became that book, The New Old Economy. And I was interested in industrial policy and realized that was convinced that if you want to do industrial policy, you actually have to understand the organizations because you're trying to influence what organizations do. And I ended up doing this work on sort of the implications of outsourcing, stuff that used to be made across by large firms, made across lots and lots of small firms, being designed across them, across many roofs. In the context of that, my advisors got involved in a project with Sue, funded by the Sloan administration, looking at component manufacturing, what Sue's later come to call the industrial commons, the sort of firms that serve as suppliers to OEMs. So that was when I first met Sue. I've also, I'm confident that I've known Stuart Macaulay longer than everybody in the room, including Juliet. Juliet's known his work longer, but I knew him as a guy at the dinner table. So I could say, I'd rather go play. She recognized my last name. I'm a University of Wisconsin faculty brat. And so I should have known about relational contracting when I was doing the dissertation, but I didn't think much about it. But I was looking at these transactions across firms, and I wrote this book, and Matt actually read it when he was in law school, and we talked to him about it, and lawyers started to read it. Juliet read it, but one of the people who read it was Lisa Bernstein, and she reached out to me and said, "Oh, there's a bunch of stuff in there that I'd really like to talk about," because I had lines in there like this. Have you ever, this is talking to a supplier up in the West, have you ever read their contracts? They're pretty ugly. Well, essentially they're one-sided. He described sending one to our attorney and he said, all these things are wrong, but shit, if you want to make the parts for them, you got to agree to it. You can get long-term agreements, but I can't outspend them in court. The contract's just a formalized handshake that says your intention is to put business here. My intention is to at least go to the bank with something to help me finance the equipment. Now, one of the things that interested me, which I'll come back to a little bit, which is behind my question to Matt, is and also is related to what Lisa said and where she ended, which comes a bit out of our conversation, a long conversation she and I had the other day, is you can think about the role of law and you can think about the role of the lawyer. As the lawyer as the sort of deal maker with technical knowledge. So who is this attorney in this contract? He's somebody who's representing that supplier and has technical knowledge, is kind of telling him what you got to do. That's so there's both technical knowledge of the law, what can happen, but there's also the deal making, and that's one of the things that's going on. In any case, out of this conversation with Lisa, she said, she wanted to talk to me, and we formed a relational contract about relational contracting, which is I just gave her, I brought her into the research team so that I could just share all of my notes with her, like all my interview transcripts. I couldn't possibly redact them. So I needed to sort of bring her into the deal that I had with them. And I just gave her everything. And because I was like, if you want to read thousands of pages of interview transcripts, go ahead. Feel free. And that sort of started this, it's like, and you can see footnote 5 in this paper she wrote about master agreements that govern, that are sort of staple to contract, but they're not enforceable, which is one of the things I know Matt is also interested in, is like, and what she's talking about, like, what's the role of the contract in making the deal happen? What's the real deal in Macaulay terms? And so she just reused the data for another purpose, and it was really useful for me. I mean, I learned a lot about it. I say it's a relational contract because I basically just trust her not to screw me on the basis of the fact that there were reputational things. We were tied by enough people, and like, what's she gonna do? It'll be fine, which it was. So one of the things, like I said, I'm interested in industrial policy and the question Matt raised, which is, and I framed, I think, well for the purposes of this panel, which is, what's the place of relational contracting theory in thinking about industrial policy in the sort of place where the state is a very big actor in the economy in all sorts of sectors? And you were referencing like Bob Scott and the sort of idea of the state interest. Well, the court, no, the state is like the government and a huge spender and is making deals itself and is structuring deals and makes the market. So you have all these organizations around. Well, and another thing on Lisa, so in relational contracting theory, one of the other things I draw on, and so I'm going to also preface this by saying one of the hardest things, one of the things I say to students, one of the hardest things in teaching is to know what you know, meaning I know things, you know things. Interdisciplinary, that's also the case. Like, what is the shared knowledge here? So I'm going to bring in a little bit of sociology here, but this is still contract. So you have Macaulay, the real deal, and McNeil, Many Futures of Contract, Matt referenced it. And the distinction, like, what exactly is the interplay of the transaction, the relation, particularly when you're talking about B2B, like business to business, these kinds of deals. And one of the lines in the Many Futures of Contract around this is like, as more real persons are involved in the transaction, it becomes more likely that some of the relational characteristics will begin to creep in, even though in theory, all those persons are part of a single monolithic center of power. And Lisa gave examples of this kind of thing when you're making a deal. These are multi-party deals with multi-parties. Now, there's a line I love in this paper, which is the presence of large numbers not only transforms transactions into relations, but also tends to make relations more relational. That's on the upper right of the slide. Well, it's not, sorry. I only shifted it down for me. If I don't do page down for you, you won't see it. This is the McNeil stuff. And I realize it's small, I'm reading it. These are kind of my notes. Below that, though, he has on that upper right, the presence of large numbers not only transforms transactions into relations, but also tends to make relations more relational. There's a footnote, this long footnote, which says, well, not long for legal scholarship, short for legal scholarship, but relations become more complex, they tend to become more bureaucratized. So there's bureaucratization. So you make these deals between large firms, you actually try and create them as single entities. But he writes, 74, the consideration of the reintroduction of transactional characteristics, modified or others, into bureaucratic contractual relations is beyond the scope of this article. Well, part of the argument that Lisa's talking about is that in a world of a particular sort of complex transactions, the actual multi-party to multi-party thing matters, meaning the boundary of the firm is not really very clear. As a legal matter, it is, but as an actual deal matter, not so much. Okay. And this is a big thing in sociology. Sort of core work, central to my own work, we talked about sort of against Williams, against transactional cost economics, is the idea of what we refer to as the always embedded economy, the interplay of markets, hierarchies, and networks in a organizational distribution. It's not as an empirical matter, thick in the tails. Williamson famously wrote, well, there's markets where things operate, where price is what governs transactions. There's hierarchies where it's fiat. And there are these hybrids, but the distribution is thick in the tails. Hybrids or networks are not the modal case. As an empirical matter, sociologists starting around late 80s, early 90s started saying, yeah, not so much. The big site here is Woody Powell. Certain forms of exchange are more dependent on relationships, mutual interest, and reputation, as well as less guided by a normal structure of authority. My aim is to identify a coherent set of factors that make it meaningful to talk about networks as a distinctive set of coordinating economic activity. So the idea is that you have relationships that run across legal, formal organizational boundaries that actually shape the nature of the transaction, the kind of things that Lisa is talking about in like needing to know who gets along, who needs to be at the table, things like that. You actually need to understand your transacting partners. I'll get to the industrial policy stuff. Another core thing in transactions cost economics, as sociologists interact with it, so we're mostly fighting with economic sociology is basically founded on fighting with economists. That's what we do. They're the big gorilla, they're the big player in the room. But the theory of discriminating alignment, which I know Juliet's going to be talking about in her paper, but for Williamson, it's a hypothesis. The discriminating alignment hypothesis is what makes transactions cost economics predictive, which is to say that different sorts of transactions will, in competitive markets, et cetera, tend to sort into some sort of optimal governance structure. And that's what makes it predictive. But if you're actually making the deals, it's normative. You're trying to actually align governance structure with transactions into the best governance structure, which is the kind of thing that you would an actual lawyer or government case, a street level bureaucrat, Matt is now both, is the question of how you want to govern deals, transactions in the economy. And for Williamson, it's the thing that's adjudicating in the market is efficiency. But if you're looking at industrial policy, you actually have to think about what are the interests you're trying to serve and for what purposes, right? You're actually trying to shape the economy. That's the point of industrial policy. For Williamson, the obvious place, he says, you start with a simple market exchange, sociological question is, why market exchange? Why not cooperation? Another key concept in Williamson is the notion of the market failure. Like, why do you have vertical integration? Well, because the market fails. Market fails in particular circumstances. Oh yeah, should probably do that. Thank you. I can read it. Why can't you? And the idea around that is a key thing that Williamson does is recognize that markets and hierarchies are different ways of structuring deals, transactions, for integrating vertically or putting it into the market are second bests. They're failing all the time. So failure is relative, better, worse. Well, one of the points that a colleague of mine, Andrew Schrank, have tried to develop is the concept of the network failure. A lot of the literature on networks is triumphalist. It talks about how great networks are and cooperation is always better, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, a lot of collaborations suck. There are a lot of dysfunctional networks out there. You can have high trust. Well, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. So one of the things we do is talk about, so you want to think about forms of dysfunctional transactions. If you want to think of discriminating exchange as being normative, like what should it be? Well, we went back to sort of classic definition of market failure, which is by a guy named Bator in '59. So what do we mean by market failure? In allocation theory, we mean the failure of a more or less idealized set of price market institutions to sustain desirable activities or to stop. I love the fact that he used to stop. That's not a typo. Is stop undesirable activities. What's the market for? Yeah, and it's basically coming around to, well, are we getting what we want? You have to think about who the we are in this kind of question, right? Well, the network failure, as we define, is by analogy the failure of a more or less idealized set of relational network institutions. Well, that's a typo. To sustain desirable activities or impede undesirable activities. So so the reason I put that up is to get to, I'm going to do this a little out of order. So the logic of that in this context is this, which is that the longstanding American and not just convention and policy framing is that when is it legitimate for governments to intervene in private affairs? In the United States, the normative answer to this question has usually been based on the concept of the market failure, a circumstance where the pursuit of private interest does not lead to efficient use of society's resource or a fair distribution of society's goods. What does it mean to try and fix a market failure if you're looking at industrial policy? Whoops, sorry. I changed it for me and not for you. Again. typically what you're trying to do is get the prices right. You're adjusting prices through taxes, other forms of subsidy. Hierarchy government failures, you're trying to get the rules and roles right by hard law eligibility rules. And then these network failures. Okay, now I'm going to go back up to what I mean by network failures. So I'm not going to talk long about this. We have a paper on it, which you're welcome to. But what makes for an efficient network? And these are sort of, you can think about what makes for good transacting. When is a network a functional governance form? When we start talking about the kinds of strategic alliances that Lisa was talking about, what went wrong between Volkswagen and Suzuki? So we have it's sort of opposite here. When there's opportunism in the network, meaning there is low opportunism, you have institution sustained trust. You also have, but people know what they're doing. Networks fail, in fact, when people screw each other or when they screw up, right? And those are actually both reasons that collaboration fails. So one of the things you need to think about in your counterparties, do they know what they're doing? When Matt was talking about like the question that was raised about FAR rules versus other professional authority. One of the things that FAR rules do is they bound in and create a sort of a trusted set of suppliers who have actually overcome a series of transactions costs. And within that, there's bidding, which what you've done is cut a bunch of people out. Now, the problem is in this sort of thing where you have ignorance or competency shortfalls among players are high, you end up with involution, which is that the government realizes that the players they can contract with don't actually know what they need to know. So they're trying to figure out how do you expand the network, even to parties who are not necessarily as trusted. The point that was made that actually some of these outside parties in OTA might have really good, really sharp lawyers, and the government can't actually get a good deal with them. But they've got the problem is they're locked into particular suppliers, right? And these are actually government contracting with, these are repeated transactions with bureaucracies. These are very high trust relationships, in fact. So you can actually think about this not so much as operating on market principles because they carved a bunch of people out. There's actually a lot of collaboration. The real deal is who reads the contract, right? This is a dysfunctional network. You can think about that. So the idea is, in a way, to theorize these different concepts, these different, what Andrew and I talk about in this is, we talk about them as policy frames. And what you're trying to do if you're trying to shape the economy in some way. I'm going to get back to sort of the role of Sue and I are going to talk about the role of relational contract. Is it the role of the lawyer or the sets of institutions that generate relations of different sorts in the economy? And what's the sort of state action behind that? I'm going to get into the actual government example. Sue, we've left most of the examples, or I'm counting on Sue for most of the examples, to be clear. But the network failure is the one that we sort of mostly operate on. Like I say we, my co-author on this is a guy named Andrew Schrank, is at Brown. The sort of tools you have at a policy level are subsidies, taxes, you change the prices, you change the incentives. You can rules and roles, regulation. But actually, if you look at what the state does in the economy, it actually does a lot of trying to, quote unquote, get the relationships right. It's connecting people to people. It's connecting firms to firms in ways that it's not that there aren't prices. When you look at, Sue will talk some about this. If you look at the CHIPS Act has enormous subsidies. Those, of course, shape what firms do. But there are also bureaucrats with a lot of technical knowledge who are connecting people, who are actually doing a lot of screening of different firms. They actually have a fair amount of discretion. They need to have it. And they're actually connecting people to this. There's actually a lot, I'll talk more about the different things that different government agencies do to actually try to generate and create network structures, to actually operate directly on the relationships. The term that Andrew and I use for this, drawing on sort of network sociology, is the notion of the catalyst broker. A catalyst brokerage is distinguished from middleman brokerage, which is what Ron Burt would talk about. A middleman brokerage is where you make your money off keeping people apart, and you connect them, and you tax it a little bit. There's a great scene in Vonnegut's God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. It talks about a young lawyer who is told by a senior partner that there's this, what a lawyer does, there's these magical moments in the economy where a large sum of money is transferred from one party to another, and there's this moment where that money doesn't belong to anybody. And that's the lawyer's moment. You take it and you find that moment and you take some. That's some magic, that's what the lawyer does. That's middleman brokerage. You're between the parties and you get your piece. Catalyst brokerage, which is what, finding us a little cynical, but a little. Justly, unjustly, that's a separate question. I'll leave that to you. We're in the law school, not the law. No, well, actually, we know we have practitioners in the room. Catalyst brokerage is where you're bringing previously unconnected parties in direct contract with each other for their mutual benefit. While their stock and trade is the introduction, they depend upon well-connected in their respective communities. They don't leave the scene once the introduction is made. They continue to work with people. This is what a lot of real corporate law is about, in fact. They're structuring deals, and there's actually general counsels who are actually working with continuously and are saying and are assessing risk and things like that, are talking about the kinds of things that Lisa is talking about. Where actually knowing the counterparty is kind of useful. It's not that you don't have the technical knowledge to structure the deal, to think about discriminating alignment, to discriminatorily align in the interest of your client. But there are moments where, you get the idea. You're actually working in a long-term sense. Okay. Now I'm going to shift to directly to industrial policy. Let's see, it's this one, right? Yeah, okay. I'm not going to talk much about this, but or this kind of sort of flag this is also going on. There's a recent paper it's forthcoming in Harvard Law and Policy Review, currently available at SRN, by Amy Kopczynski and Joel Michaels, called Administering a Democratic Industrial Policy. We just had a big conference on industrial policy at Columbia, I'm affiliated with a Center on Political Economy there and run something called the Firm's Industrial Policy Lab. Ran the conference with a guy named Joe Stiglitz, who you might have heard of, who's really a lovely man. But we also had Joel Michaels there. He works at the Treasury. He's a straight level bureaucrat. He was talking in his own capacity, not representing Treasury. Matt's here in his own capacity, not representing DOD. But one of the things that they talk about is, so we're talking about, Lisa says contract law is dead. They go after administrative law. And they say that administrative law scholarship has ignored the distinctive tools of industrial policy, such as grant making, lending, government contracts, and ownership stakes. These tools require flexibility and discretion and often cannot be and are not constrained by conventional administrative law tools like notice and comment rulemaking, judicial review. Literature on industrial policy argues bureaucratic autonomy and flexibility, but also has little account of how this power can be accountable in a democracy. One of the things that the argument that, you ask Joel, like off behind the scenes, what they're doing is like, we have a lot of discretion. We're telling people what programs are available. We're actually trying to make deals happen. So again, the kinds of things, from some other work with Andrew Frank, but the kinds of things that government is doing here in industrial policy, they're buyers, they grants tax incentives, they're a source, they provide technologies to the national labs, they're standard setters. These are things that are these are conventional mitigation of industrial policy, or if you're looking at the standard setter, you're setting the rules, you're basically setting up the market in this stuff, but there's a bunch of other stuff. And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Sue for more examples that you see state actors doing. And this is what I mean about the role for the lawyer, like the technical stuff, but also in the room making the deal happen. This is the sort of question about where relational contracting theory and industrial policy might intersect. Someone was talking to Matt about at dinner last night. Like, where are the places, like you're the lawyer talking to a bunch of DOD and bureaucrats, what are the things they don't know? What are the things you're trying to do as a street level bureaucrat, bringing technical knowledge? Right? And Sue's going to talk more about this. But like DARPA, which is a thing, sociology, people who study industrial policy love DARPA because it's this weird thing with a ton of other transactional authority, where people have limited terms in government. They are connected to universities, and they are in the economy, and they're system integrators who re-architect social networks. The FCC is a collaborative public space, which actually tries to bring people together to talk about technologies. The national labs actually generate spinoffs. They're aware that they generate spinoffs. Andrew's got Schrank has a beautiful paper about the Los Alamos. Set up if you set up your spinoff outside of Los Alamos, you could actually have 2 years leave from the national lab and come back in. You had a guarantee of a job. What they were doing is actually mitigating your risk, but they were also having meetings of these various spinoffs and startups in New Mexico to try and get them to keep them connected to the national labs, keep themselves connected to spinoffs, small business innovation research, service matchmakers, NIST MEP, which I can talk about ad infinitum because I do a ton of research on it. But they are actually often like the NIST MEP delivers small services, small and mid-sized manufacturers. MEP centers actually some of them have founded the industry associations in their states because they're like, yeah, we need these firms to talk to each other. They're generating relations. Now, is that relational contract? Is that a place relational contracting theory is there? What's the government interest in sort of shaping the network structure of the economy, and how can you do that? And on that note, I will turn it over to Professor Sue Helper.
Great. Yes. Great. Thank you. Okay. Great. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and thanks, Juliet, for putting this great group of people together that I only had to cross the street to get. So I have changed my talk a lot just with the first couple of presentations. So we will see how this goes. So I am going to. Let's see. Oh, that changes that there. All right. Okay, so I want to just start with some definitions. Then I want to talk about relational contracts in autos, and then in relational contracts in policy. And so what I realized is I'm going to first the part of automotive policy that I'm going to focus on is actually not the innovation part. So I think that's a different part of the value chain than we've been talking about a lot. So things are much more structured, but there's still a role for relational contracts, I want to argue. And there's, I think, three sorts of parties that are involved in these relational contracts. So one is the relational contract between government and firms. And second, between firms in a supply chain. And then third, prompted by Lisa's points, about relationships between or among government actors themselves. And these are all, I want to argue, important for thinking about the role of relational contracts in the success of industrial strategy. And I guess a question, particularly on the third thing about bringing in the government actors and the different agency issues between agencies. What does the relational contract lens add, if anything? So I think that's a question to think about. It's for a while people have said personnel is policy. Okay, great. If we bring in this relational contract lens, what does that add? I mean, I think one of the things that maybe adds as well, it's these. Well, let me get to my definition here. So if we think of a relational contract as agreements based on subjective measures of performance that could neither be fully specified beforehand nor verified after the fact, and then the key point, thus enforced by the shadow of the future. So this, it's not enforced by a court; it's enforced by the future desire to do future business together. So that's the first thing. And then what do we mean by industrial strategy? And here I sort of a definition that built on other people's definitions, but sort of government efforts to transform the economy, not just run it, but transform it, especially through policies designed to affect particular industries. We can discuss that. So I want to first start with talking about relational contracts between firms. And talk about why that matters for the outcomes of industrial strategy. And so this is some work using micro trade data. And the key finding, again, with building on what Lisa said, that you need to think about not just individual transactions, because companies have strategies about using relational contracts that are stable, not easily changeable. And the reason is they affect most functions of a corporation, not just procurement. And so just an example here is if we look at the subset of parts that are R&D intense. So if you think about theory of discriminating alignment, if we looked at this transaction by transaction, we'd want to, for the low R&D parts, those are commodities, we want to have zillions of suppliers so that we can pick and choose and they're bargaining against themselves really toughly, right? If it's an R&D, high R&D thing, we might want to think about very few numbers of suppliers so that we can collaborate with them. And so we're able to look at this with this trade data. We can actually see every part that's imported by every automaker acting in the US. So an example of an observation, I have to be very careful here because the fact of filing this is, but it's an example would be a company like General Motors importing, say, a steering wheel from Canada into the US for use in an assembly plant in Detroit. Or similarly, Toyota importing a steering wheel from Mexico for their plant in Kentucky. And so then what we see is two things from that graph. One is that it appears that the American automakers have in fact read Williamson. As the R&D intensity of the part goes up, the number of suppliers goes down. So that's very consistent. On the other hand, if you look at the red line, this is the Japanese suppliers, Japanese automakers. It varies a tiny bit, but in general, it doesn't matter what the nature of the commodity is that they're buying. They tend to have relatively few suppliers per part. And it's interesting that even at the most, even the most R&D intensive part bought by an American automaker, they have more suppliers per part than the Japanese do on their most commoditized part. So so the point is here that there are these strategies. And so then why do they specialize? Why is this hard to change? And so we go think about Gibbons and Henderson, relational contracts build credibility. You can show over time that these things are enforceable. It's complicated to see for an outside supplier that, oh yeah, they left that supplier, but that was a commodity. I'm making R&D. That's not so easy to tell. And then just clarifying what the relational contract is. Quality. What is a high quality part? It actually turns out it's quite different for the same a company or a plant making the same part for Toyota and GM. There's different definitions of what makes a quality part. Toyota is much more concerned about surface blemishes, for example, than GM, and that's tacit. So again, it's easier if you have one kind of thing. It also promotes complementarities across functions in the buyer's organization. So we want to have collaboration. You want to get ideas from suppliers. So you want the engineering department to be open to that and to understand and to seek out these ideas. If you want to have and maintain competition, you're really afraid that the supplier is going to get to that engineer and have them design a spec that means that they're the only one that can supply it. So you're going to close it off much more. You're also going to have different career paths. If you want your procurement agents to be having multiple goals, you got to train them more, pay them more, rather than if it's just is supplier A's cost greater than supplier B's costs? That's cheaper and much easier to manage. That's the kind of first part. And I guess one thing I wanted to say actually that Matt brought up resilience, that I think there's another way that the nature of these relationships affects resilience. Not just in the contracts, but if you have a relational contract, you can promote resilience in a couple different ways. One is you have an incentive and you have the information mechanisms to realize there's a problem early. If it's competitive, you really don't want your customer to know that there's a problem at all, ever. If it's collaborative, you're going to have to deal with this problem later, there's an incentive to bring it up early. Second, there's a reason to or an ability to become, quote, more agile. And so this is, I think, a very different way to deal with resilience. The way that the papers you're talking about deal with resilience or create resilience is through redundancy. You have many parts, many suppliers. Another way is agility, where you have just a few suppliers, but they react quickly. And so relational contracts gives you the ability to think about and build capability, organizational slack, that people can be creative, think about ways to solve problems. So I think those are, the relational contracts and resilience are actually quite related, I think. And happy to talk more about some work I'm doing on that. Let's see, now I'm going backwards. Okay, so then what are some issues in the relational contracts in the EV transition? So one is just the timing of the transition. So you have to have multiple tiers of suppliers making investments. So you're a supplier, you might want to switch from making you have a bunch of stamping equipment, machining equipment, you can use it, you typically use it to make transmission parts for internal combustion engine. You can switch over and make electric motors. But when do you make that investment? And it depends in part. I met a guy yesterday morning who had made a bunch of investments, brought a whole bunch of CNC machines to make electric motors for Ford. Ford is now very dramatically slowing its investment, doing more hybrids. This is a problem. And so the willingness to make the investment in the first place and then to deal with what happens if the transition is slower depends in both on relational contracts and then sometimes on the formal contract. So how is distress going to be managed? The ownership of investment, this comes back again to Matt's point about, if you control the batteries, you can control a lot about what goes on inside the US. And then the distribution of gains from investments. Okay. And so then so talking about these, yeah, thank you. The policies. So these are kind of the key policies here, and I want to talk through a little bit about relational contracts and how they're involved in these policies. First thing is setting goals. So there was a lot of effort that went into this, and I just thought, this is dumb. This is not enforceable. This is, this is 2030. So the goal was that 50% of US vehicle sales would be electric vehicles by 2030. So this is, beyond even a hypothetical second term. What difference does it make? Well, it turns out it was actually key because a lot of information was gained in setting this goal. You want to set a reasonable goal, one that pushes people but is not impossible. And so there's a lot of discussion that went around to it. And then it's a coordination mechanism. To make sure that everybody's advancing more or less at the same rate. A second thing then is supply side subsidies. And so then these are both in the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. So they are for batteries and components, conversion of plants, and electric vehicle chargers. I think I want to argue that there was a lot of relational contracts involved in designing the way these subsidies were written, but I think, or at least the goal, is to have relational contracts not matter very much at all in the delivery of the subsidies, so that everybody should apply on an equal footing. And these are smaller grants. I mean, I think in the CHIPS Act, where there's really 3 companies that could get those giant subsidies to build a fab, this is at least potentially more companies. And there's a desire not to have discretion among government bureaucrats. So I think that's something we need to kind of think about and understand. So just some examples of the design side. I guess one thing that the Biden administration did was bring in another actor, i.e. unions, into the industrial strategy process. And that's actually, for unions to be directly involved is not so typical in any country, really, as far as I understand. And so that had some interesting implications. So we have a new set of actors bringing in. So there's giant subsidies for building new plants of different types, and there's a wrinkle. The tax credit is tripled if you have an apprenticeship program and if you pay a prevailing wage. And so this is not something that has ever been in US law before. It's typical, there's a division of labor among agencies. Treasury designs these things and administers these things. When I first got to the Biden administration, so actually when I first physically showed up, which I started in March and then was on this call in July. And on this call were about 10 people. So people from the White House and people from Treasury to decide this. We were kind of discussing the framework for the Inflation Reduction Act, or what became that. No one from the Department of Energy, no one from the Department of Labor. And the reason is that these are going to be tax credits. Treasury does tax credits. And so then the initial comments, the initial way they were going to design and enforce this apprenticeship and prevailing wage stuff, because there's a lot of, you got to pay, you got to get pay records. How does this all work? Treasury made up a whole process. And then there is, in fact, an interagency process for getting comments. The comments from DOL were scathing. Like, don't you know that we have been doing prevailing wage in construction for decades? We have a body of knowledge on this. Well, Treasury didn't know. And so then there was a mechanism set up eventually of, I guess we could call it a joint governance committee, but now there are, for just once the provisions were passed, how are they going to be implemented? How are you going to define terms like foreign entity of concern? That's now a committee where there's DOL, DOE, Treasury people, and these are worked out in advance, or it's a joint process. I guess a question I think is, okay, we knew that personnel is policy and it mattered that we had these labor people and it mattered, whatever, but do we get anything? And I guess so one thing would be that part of what goes into this is sort of thinking about what are the relationships with these people going to be after they leave government or something, which I think also matters. Let's see, what else do I want to say about these? Yeah, I think that's probably enough. So just to kind of talk really quickly about some outcomes. Auto employment actually is up. There's a bunch of measures of success. There's been a lot of press about the electric vehicle transition has slowed. What's really seen is a slowing in the rate of increase of adoption. So we're still actually ahead of projections made even as recently as last year. There's been huge amounts of investment here. And so this comes back another place we might think about relational contracts mattering. So economists have been worried about industrial strategy because of an argument that the government money crowds out company money. And so you're having the government spend, and usually spend inefficiently, money that companies would have spent anyway. And the Biden theory has been very different, that there are reasons why companies don't spend. So one is, spillovers. We don't have a carbon tax, so now you subsidize companies and they take into account that the EVs have less, or solar or whatever, have fewer carbon emissions. But you also identify bottlenecks, so that if you want an electric vehicle transition, you need batteries. And so promoting investment in batteries is then going to promote investment in transitioning assembly plant facilities and vice versa, because you don't want to build a bunch of batteries unless you all know that they're going to be sold in plants. This is a mistake. Well, this matching of supply and demand is actually quite a difficult problem. I don't know that relational contracts. I guess this is where the convening and the goal setting is actually really important. You got to build supply, and with the idea that there's going to be demand, and this doesn't always happen. So some of the Obama strategies really worked only on supply, not on demand. In PPE, we spent $1 billion on subsidies to build plants, and then did not coordinate even the government demand. And so some of these plants went out of business because they were, after the pandemic, demand fell and China increased its subsidies and its ability to provide cheaply. We did not have a government in place to buy or the incentives actually to switch. Despite a law that's called the Make PPE in America Act, it was very difficult to get agencies to abide by that law. We can talk about that. But anyway, this crowding in theory drove a lot of this, and I think there's evidence that it actually works. That we've had billions of dollars of investment, and this is, you can see the timing that this looks like it was really spurred a lot by these policies, and it's not all subsidized. So about for every $1 of subsidy, there's been about $6 of investment in private investment in clean energy. And so costs of EVs are coming down. Some areas that are more problematic is charging, that there's been an increase in charging, but there's been, it's not as much as we need, and this is a reason why things are slowing. I think, and I think there's some issues with relational contracts there that I'm not going to talk about. If you want to save some time for discussion. A key issue, though, is small suppliers, and this is something that I think is a kind of a network failure, in that the big companies, particularly, so a lot of the discussion was with the big American union companies. Not Tesla, and not initially, at least, Toyota and Honda. And these companies tend not to have relationships, relational contracts with any suppliers, but especially not the small suppliers that are, the second or third tier. And so it wasn't even realized at the beginning, I think, that this was going to be an issue. This is something I was raising issues about, that you would actually have these problems. There's a problem in getting the demand certainty I've talked about. There's also a problem of maybe relational contracts with the public, and sort of feeling like you need to spend a lot of money to vet these things, and so it can be as expensive to vet a $5 million loan as a $100 million loan. So it's very difficult to get money to these suppliers. Maybe I'll leave that there. So what are some lessons? I think I've said most of these things. Then to move to kind of relational contracts, I think we should think about this a lot as a coordination game. And I think this fits with Lisa's project management point. If you're managing a project, you tend to be not not all that concerned about opportunism. You're on the same team. Here, but coordination is really hard, and so opportunism is maybe takes a back seat to bounded rationality in Williamsonian terms, and so these coordination mechanisms are really important. Subsidies alone are not sufficient. To build the necessary RCs, there's often a lack of information. One of the things we tried to do is, in fact, and there's manufacturing conversion grants, but basically incentivize companies to set up relational contracts with their own workers. So project labor agreements, setting up, we gave extra points on some of these grants if they had problem-solving committees with their workers, that kind of stuff. So to conclude, companies have strategies about using relational contracts. And so the entire firm we should think about as a key unit of analysis, not just an individual transaction. There's a big network of parties that are involved and should be involved in making a successful industrial strategy. And that what goes on and the ability to build clear, credible contracts within and between firms really affects the success of industrial strategy. So thanks.
All right, we don't have a tremendous amount of time before lunch, but I'd love to hear either any discussion among the panelists or if there are questions from the audience.
First, thank you so much. I have a few questions that kind of connect the different things that were discussed. And that is one, with regards to strategic alliances, to my knowledge, at least the last time I looked at it a few years ago, 90% of them fail, right? There's different reasons for the failure. Sometimes it's different management. We've also, in the government context, as you mentioned, the issue of high barriers to entry of smaller players. I guess, what are some of the things that you think, I know we already have those innovations, right? Some innovations that are put in place, like this alternative contracting mechanism, but it still is not fixing some of these issues. Do you think there's a different type of design that can help, or we just have to accept the fact that we're going to have this market failure no matter what we do?
Lisa, you want to take a first crack at that? I could say something as well.
Me? I guess for me, I think that if in designing alliances, people realize that in a lot of instances, they're almost like mergers for a particular purpose, and started focusing more on the things that we take into account when we decide whether a merger is going to lead to synergy, the kinds of governance things and project management plans. I think we may be looking at the wrong level of governance. We might need much more particularized governance, and that has the potential to help in these areas. I don't know where the 90% number comes from. The last one I saw was the 70% failure number, but what was interesting to me about that number is people broke it down, and there were some firms that seemed to systematically do this better than other firms. So maybe a first crack would be to look at those firms and see what they're doing that's so different, if anything, in terms of governance or transaction features.
Please.
Josh,
Go.
do you
No,
want
no,
to
no.
step
Go
in?
ahead and get another question on, and then.
Oh. Well, I had another question. And that was, I was fascinated by Lisa's introduction, and I wondered if there would be a way to talk to firms about these insights so that you could get their reaction to these points, and then that could sort of inform how firms might, act in the future using these insights. I mean, that would be so fascinating. And Lisa, I'm sure you're going to undertake a study.
Well, I wish, sort of. I'm going to go to World Commerce and Contracting, and with Roberto Fernandez and Chagai Vlhovsky, we are going to do a program on the three lenses for one of their groups of contracting executives. And we are going to ask people to analyze a transaction success or transaction failure through the lenses as part of our workshop. But if you have any suggestions, one of the reasons we're doing this is WCC likes to have academics study the businesses who are their members. So if you have any ideas about how, Juliet, I'd love to hear them, because we are going to try.
Great.
Well, I'll actually try and say something about both questions. Part of the idea of calling, distinguishing market and network failures and what you should do about them. So one of the things I had below the slide is sometimes you just want to blow them up like it was a bad idea. But one of the other things that's going on in calling in fails, if you look at biotech alliances, Woody Powell has a bunch of work on that. And one of the big points he makes, and this has to do with different sort of relational institutional structures, is he talks about the concept of the graceful exit, which is that some strategic alliances should fail. They were hypotheses, they tried it, it was a bad idea, but you find out by trying out. There was no better design. So the real thing was when you pull the plug. That's actually not a failed strategic alliance. That is, it's a little bit like, what was the problem with Solyndra? Well, the problem with Solyndra wasn't, if you have it, call it a portfolio model of lending, which was actually, Tesla actually got key loans from the same program, is that they didn't pull the plug too early, partially because they had made a big point out of it, and then they needed this one of the portfolio to go well, as opposed to, we have a portfolio and strategic alliance. So that's one of the issues on it. But then the ones that you look back and say, what was the mistake? That's one of the things that I think Lisa is talking about, trying to disaggregate failures, not from, where part of actually success is pulling the plug at the right moment. In terms of knowing stuff, I think one of the reason I sort of started off where I did is like, I wasn't going in to ask about contracts or law or anything like that. I was talking about relationships between firms. And then lawyers like, yeah, you're talking about contracts. I'm like, oh yeah, you're right, I am. So I was asking a different kind of questions. And then Lisa did follow-up interviews, including with many of the same companies, focusing on other sorts of things, but building out of us. So that's the sort of disciplinary back and forth around questions. Like Juliet, I know, is like talked with, like the thing about interviews with different players, not just the lawyers, parties who maybe should have been in the room. So there's some of these other sorts of things that you want to talk about, or on the industrial policy side. Part of the point Sue's making is like, who's in the room when you design the policy actually shapes the, should the lawyers have been there? Should they be kept out? Other kinds of questions are interesting to think about. If you think about the space that enforces is actually a question that it's interesting. It's been interesting to me to dialogue with lawyers around some of this stuff because it's a different set of questions that maybe maybe I should have asked that. That would have been interesting.
I just want to say, I think that who's in the room is also critical for the negotiation and performance of contracts, and also how many rooms are used in the negotiation. Sue and I were at a conference in June where one of the presenters discussed how she would, in the negotiation stage, separate out the pie increasers from the pie dividers. And so in a way, one of the things we have to start thinking about is, my talk focused on sort of the deal and forward, but we also have to go backward, because a lot of what happens between the parties before anything called the deal or the contract can be very outcome determinative. When you go to take the contract or the alliance into the field, how good is the matching process? Because as you said, some alliances really should fail. But the better we can get the match on the front end, the less failure we should have on the back end. And I think there's been insufficient attention to where match is critical, where sort of match versus contract is a trade-off as important as make or buy.
I guess I may say two quick things. One is, it seems like just because the alliance ended doesn't mean it necessarily failed. So think about General Motors and Toyota in the NUMMI plant in California. That ended, but Toyota learned a ton about how to operate in the U.S. market. General Motors learned a little bit that they implemented sporadically about the Toyota production system. The second thing, I think, on the the insights, and one of the things, so government procurement agents actually have a lot more discretion than they use. So the FAR is 1,000 pages. It doesn't just say use competitive bidding. So there's a problem with some of the design of this, that the contracting official is a very separate person from the requirements officer who determines, and so it's sort of difficult to, one of the things I worked on with not much success actually was to try to get the MEPs to sort of think about, could we change some of the specs, and then that would allow US firms to be competitive. That it just turned, and I don't still fully understand why that's so hard and so difficult. there's clearly the relational contract that the procurement people have, you know, with their own supervisors and their own organizations makes them very reluctant to use the discretion that they have. You know, maybe right now with the government apparatus going to be under the control of a different party, maybe I'm actually happy about that. But it's, I think, an interesting question.
I believe that's our time. So I want to thank our panelists for a very thought-provoking session. And we will break for lunch and reconvene at 1 p.m. Thank you, Lisa.
Good to see you.
Comparing this and the next one, there was no width. It's just compare. That's because without you didn't send answer again, so I wrote that when I sent it to you.
Well, first of all, in the background, the architect.
I was really mad. I might have been. Not in there. But no, 135 to 137, and I physically could not fix it. Oh, that was by far the worst one.
Marcel Boyer did.
That way in this one, I decided that is unfortunately not. So I just wrote Olivia is able to did not provide citation and then moved on with my life. For sure. I felt like an at me for explaining to me and she was like, well, actually, if you don't like this, here's an entire another source for it. I was like, please, I'm sending everything. I don't know if she was gonna apply for it.
So, my father was with the firm Roger Oliver Construction and Architect out in. He was okay.
That's true.
And anyway, he died a couple of years ago. And yeah, my husband's.
Yes, and
agreements.
Yes. You're talking about consensus conflicts. Okay, here's my husband. Hear a report from them. You see?
Well, I mean,
I have a great paper.
That's fine. It's just so you know, but one of our first games.
yeah, correct.
This is great. It's fun. My mother was a lawyer. Went to law school started in 1953.
Well, she's
was pretty unusual. Pretty cool. My father's teaching architecture at the University, and I was in his group, and she didn't have any children, and she wanted to do something interesting.
fine with you just sitting there, right off the bat, just or this was like Sunday night. She's done it. Don't tell me hi. I finished it. I don't know. That's why the rules are different. Like I get the emails at and then Andrew. I don't know if this is right, but here's 5 other choices.
Saw you guys adding each other. I thought it was cute.
Oh my gosh, I wasn't flashes. Every single time never regret. So I know she's smart, but she's so busy that she doesn't. It's just
What?
Maybe online already.
Yeah.
I
don't know
if you're on
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
We just walk around. I know.
Okay.
Well, sorry about no, there's a reason I'm not talking certain. No, and I was like, like, really? I will.
I don't see you coming. I think we can start.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm Professor Eric Chafee. I'm the co-director of the Center for Business Law and a professor here at the law school, along with Juliet Kostrycki. We're very happy that all of you are here. It's been a wonderful conference so far, and despite the lousy moderator of this one, I'm sure that this panel will be no exception. So this panel is consensus templates, interviews from biopharma and relational and contextual aspects of collaborations. Similar to Professor Korsmo, and I'll state it even more briefly, my view on moderating is moderation, meaning that I'll just simply introduce the speakers, although I would recommend taking a look at their bios, learn more about them. They definitely are the right people to have in the room, so to speak. But today we're going to hear from George Contreras, the James T. Jensen Endowed Professor for Transactional Law and Director of the Program on Intellectual Property and Technology Law from the University of Utah School of Law. We're going to hear from Juliet Kostrycki, the Everett D. and Eugenia S. McCurdy Professor of Contract Law and Director of the Center for Business Law at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and Goethe Hessen, General Counsel and Secretary of the Board of Directors from Farah Vial during today's panel. And with that, I'm going to let George take it away.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Ken. Thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this this distinguished symposium. I really appreciate it. So, in addition to this, I guess a few things you should know about me, especially given the conversations that we've had this morning. So I was a transactional lawyer for 17 years before becoming an academic. I practiced. I was that intellectual property transactions guy sitting in the corner that Matthew Jennejohn ultimately found through the dusty corridors of his law firm. And enjoyed that practice and enjoyed it so much that I wrote a case book about this topic and continued to teach it, and have remained interested in it throughout the years that I've been an academic. This particular project that I'll talk about today is co-authored with Leanne Hancock, who's a professor of architecture, and you'll understand why this is. Our collaboration goes back many, many years to when we were both at Washington University in St. Louis. But with that, let me just get started, okay, and explain to you what this project is about. Contractual templates are like well-known creatures in the world of contract. They are standardized sets of contractual terms. I say cookie cutter terms. What we are focusing on is not the business to consumer boilerplate, the kind of agreements that you agree with when you get a new cell phone contract or an online service. These are the business-to-business documents that form the starting point, sometimes for quite significant transactions. They outline parties' responsibilities, risks, liabilities, and are often heavily negotiated once they begin negotiation from a common template. They are directed to specific recurring types of transactions, usually in a particular market segment. We've heard about some of these today. Supply chain, automotive is especially fond of these types of templates. Commodities, M&A, maybe investment, and so forth. There are many advantages of these. They're well understood by market participants, meaning legal counsel, also advisors, financial advisors, bankers, accountants, and often the principals who are engaged in these deals. These types of agreements have been subject to some antitrust competition law scrutiny. They're covered in the European Commission's guidelines on horizontal arrangements in a whole chapter called Standard Terms. I spend much of my time as an academic looking at technology standardization, which is chapter 7 of these EC horizontal guidelines, which have garnered far more attention, I have to say, than chapter 8. So I'm now switching to something that is related but slightly different. So why are these types of templates beneficial? There are numerous reasons. First, they reduce transaction costs. You don't have to draft a complex agreement from scratch every time, it's sort of self-explanatory. But beyond that, they also reduce errors and risks. If you draft a contract from scratch, say it's a contract to develop a new shopping center or a new 80-story skyscraper, there's a lot that goes into one of those contracts. If you trust yourself as a lawyer simply to come up with it from scratch, obviously, you're going to omit things. And so these templates serve to protect lawyers from themselves and their own omissions or errors. There's also a benefit of interpretive consistency. If many players in the industry are starting from a common set of contractual terms that ultimately end up in executed agreements in their final form, then courts will have an opportunity to interpret those terms, and then parties down the road will have at least some judicial guidance with respect to what the terms mean. And unlike the debenture counsel, who each have a different interpretation for different clauses of some of their agreements, there are entire books that offer guides to judicial interpretation of, say, the architecture and construction contracts that I'll talk about in a moment. You also have signaling functions that arise from these types of templates and their usage. If you show up to the negotiation with a well-known and well-understood template document that shows to some degree that you know what you're doing, you're in the club and not an outsider who's not to be trusted. And then finally, speaking of trust, there is some degree of trust in the bodies who create these agreements, but that varies. And again, this is something that I'll talk about a bit later in the talk. So how do we get these standardized contracts that businesses use as a starting points for negotiations in these large B2B transactions? Well, sometimes there's no coordination at all. We have just uncoordinated convergence of contractual terms. The de facto standardization that arises through uncoordinated market activity. We see this on the technology side of things. This is how things like PDF, the portable document format developed by Adobe, becomes standards. No standard body said that PDF should be a standard for fixed format documents, but it became that because it was well designed and became popular. We also have a large amount of literature, some of which has been referenced already, on the sort of de facto standardization of agreement forms. There may be a particular company or law firm whose agreement is so good and so concise and fair that others begin to use it, and it becomes an industry template without any kind of deliberative action toward that goal. You can also have unilateral standardization, right? Entities, particularly large suppliers or purchasers, automotive firms are a good example, who dictate to their supply chains, okay, everybody who wants to supply to General Motors is going to use this particular supply contract, and most of their suppliers, if they do want to do the business, agree to that. And then, at least for that supply chain, which is often hundreds of different entities, there is some standardization. Government, of course, mandates its own forms and its procurement function, its contracting function, and Matt earlier talked about the FARs and so forth, which are the epitome of government mandated forms. You can also have intermediaries who create templates for the industry. These, we can think about these as law firms, particularly in the mergers and acquisition space. Every big Wall Street firm has its own set of forms, particularly an M&A form. and uses that form in all of its deals when it is the entity that gets to hold the pen and draft the first set of agreements. Much older than this are the old form books produced by learned authors, professors, and practitioners with experience in the field. But I'm not going to cover any of those modes of standardization. What I am most interested in this project are consensus templates, template documents that are developed through a deliberative, intentional, consensus-based process that is led by the industry. These documents are adopted on a voluntary basis, but still can become pervasive. So this weird little diagram just shows what we perceive to be efficiency benefits from having these sorts of standardized consensus templates that are adopted industry-wide, as opposed to in the upper left, you see the 16 contracts required, right, when you have bilateral contracting among 4 different parties. Even the one in the upper right column is what happens when you have vertical integration by individual firms. The General Motors example, each firm requires its supply chain to use its own contracts. The lower left are when law firms develop contract templates that they use for their own clients, which could be on either side of these deals. But of course, the big inclusive circle that embraces everybody is the consensus template. But right, easier said than done, right? So there has been a bit of literature, not a huge amount, but some literature around this mode of consensus template contract generation with some distinguished writers, right? Carl Llewellyn from Harvard Law School, an early proponent of this type of contractual agreement and consensus. Other names there that you undoubtedly recognize, including just this year, a paper by Mito Gulati and his co-authors who are very active in the literature on individual clause standardization and deviation, coming around and realizing that these broad consensus templates are out there and not enough is written about them, and urging the field to think more about these. And so the questions that this all raises for us are the following. Like, how are these consensus templates developed? As a matter of institutional environment, institutional economics, the development processes that are utilized, and how similar are these processes to technical standardization, the processes in which competitors get together to develop interoperability standards like Wi-Fi, 5G, and Bluetooth. And then, secondly, what makes a good process? What contributes to the success or failure of these templates once they're developed? Is it the development environment, competition, dynamics within the industry, or possibly the regulatory environment? So these are questions that we set out to tackle in this project. These templates have been around, again, for a long time, going back to sort of the very beginning of modern contractual history, but most importantly, and the real beginning of this practice from our standpoint is the American Institute of Architects Uniform Contract, which surprisingly developed shortly after the Civil War. And I'll talk about it in more detail on the next slide. But this late 19th century post-Civil War era corresponded with the development of standards for manufacturing, machinery, and so forth. And if you look at the early writing, including by Llewellyn, who of course was an early legal realist, you will see that there is the writers of that time took a lot of clues from the world of industrial standardization and tried to port it over to contractual standardization. So over the 20th century, we get a few of these. The financial sector, an early adopter of this mode of activity for reasons that we'll talk about in just a moment. So the architect's document is quite interesting, and we actually have a separate paper, sort of a deep dive case study on the development of the architecture, general conditions, which are not in this paper. But after the Civil War, things started to change rapidly in the United States as building and construction became more advanced. Architecture itself became more of a profession, and specialization was introduced into this industry, where electricity, mechanical structures, air conditioning, and so forth, the use of steel in buildings, all contributed to a number of independent specialist contractors who had to be marshaled together to build what were becoming taller and taller buildings in Chicago, New York, and so forth. And the architect kind of took me. Julia, I just learned that Juliet's come from a family of architects, so I look forward to her comments and corrections after all of this. But the uniform contract that arose in 1888 was the product of a collaboration between the American Institute of Architects and the National Builders Association, the people who actually included the masons and the carpenters and so forth who were in the building trades. The architects, importantly, kind of placed themselves at the top of the building and construction pyramid, which became a problem later on. A suite of contracts emerged by the early 20th century, approved by none other than Samuel Williston of Williston contract treatise fame, for those of you who study contracts. And things went well for about a century under this set of contracts. But clouds emerged in the 1970s as the Association of General Contractors began to bristle at the architects' agreements that basically placed no liability with the architects, but allowed the architects to control the construction process. The architects viewed themselves as the representatives of the building owners. And so the contractors started to think differently about this, and eventually hired their own internal counsel and developed their own set of terms. This is just a construction management agreement that was released as long ago as 1980. But in 2007, the real break occurred. The contractors refused to endorse the 2007 edition of the architects' standard agreements and created their own set of standardized documents, which in the technology space is what we would call a standards war. There are lots of interesting twists and turns to this war, which goes on today. Although the architects' agreement is still predominant in the United States, the contractors' form has generally gotten a fair foothold in the market. All right, so this is a very long and to us interesting case study. We decided to look at a number of instances in which consensus templates were developed in addition to the architects, all of which are well known and, most importantly for us, have a secondary literature that has developed around them. The ISDA, swaps and derivatives, People's Master Agreement, the EDI agreement developed by the American Bar Association, the venture capital set of legal and investment documents, and the biotech material transfer agreement that the National Institutes of Health spearheaded the development of. So across different industries and different modes of development and institutional organization. And again, to make a very long story a little bit shorter, we compared the development processes for these 5 sets of consensus templates, looked at the development environment in which they arose, whether it was an industry group, as you had with ISDA. All of the swaps and derivatives dealers got together, or at least their in-house counsel got together with their outside counsel to develop these forms. And as a result, adoption is quite high, and there really isn't a competitor. if you're doing business in this admittedly rarefied space, you are probably using one of the master agreements that the ICA came up with, which differs from the situation with the architects. One of the difficulties that the architects found was that they were viewed as a single dominant stakeholder who came up with the template agreement. Other stakeholders, the contractors, but also building engineers who have their own set of template documents, bristled at this and eventually defected. So adoption is still fairly high, but not universal. And there are some major competitors in the US. Internationally, there's an entirely different set of consensus documents. The FIDIC contractual construction documents are pretty pervasive. And for people who are not in the building and construction industry, and I'm not, my colleague, obviously, who's an architect, this is the second largest industry in the world after financial services. It is a $1 trillion industry just in the United States. There are huge amounts of dollars that flow through these contracts. So they're fairly significant and to some degree underappreciated, I think, at least among legal academics. The American Bar Association, which all of us in the room probably are familiar with, led a standardization project around electronic data interchange, supply chain agreements, which was not taken up very much despite a lengthy multi-year process that seemed to involve a lot of consensus, at least amongst lawyers, on its drafting committee. But there are literally dozens of EDI competitors here, not only single firm supply chain agreements, but also what purport to be consensus templates for other groups, UN agencies, treatise authors, various nonprofits and trade associations. The venture capital group, which created a set of legal documents, came from an industry group also marshaled by one person, the general counsel of a Boston venture capital firm, who got a dozen people together and said, you know, it's ridiculous that we're using different agreements for the identical transactions. Let's come up with a single set of forms, and was fairly successful, although individual law firms do still use their own forms occasionally. And then finally, we have the government. The government tried to step in and rationalize materials transfer agreements. These are the agreements that universities and pharmaceutical companies use when they want to get a sample, a cell line, a DNA sample, a model organism that some other group has developed purely for research purposes, not even for commercialization, just to do research on it. And it's a huge obstacle. Every university has its own forms. They don't interact well at all, and scientists routinely complain about what a barrier and inefficient system this is. So NIH stepped in and did try to rationalize this, and many people participated nevertheless due to what we believe is inherent stickiness in institutional legal departments and forms. It's finding relatively low adoption. And again, we talk about each of these at more length in the paper. So what takeaways did we gather here? What makes these projects successful or not? Well, trust in the process is sort of an idea of legitimacy. Really is one of the principal things that we identified. And by the way, we interviewed numerous people in these fields to try to derive some of these attributes. Also important, the animation is slightly off kilter here on this slide. Like transaction types, right? The deals have to be very similar in order to have a standardized template that is more than just a skeletal framework. There is also a significant first mover advantage. The architects had this advantage for about a century, which is pretty good in terms of a legal document before others mobilized to try to challenge them. The engagement of all relevant stakeholder groups is quite important, as it is on the technology standardization side. Balance in the drafting committees. Having a committee with only architects, or like 12 architects and one general contractor, generally is not perceived to be very balanced and will often result, whatever the merits are, in a document that favors one group or one stakeholder interest unduly. Adaptability is also important. These templates tend to stick around for a long time. And as a result, if the drafters want them to have longevity, they need to ensure that they can be updated as technology changes, as business practices change. And so the architects have a 10-year review and update cycle. Some of the other groups have a shorter cycle. And then finally, you have the issue of divergence or defection from the form. Law firms are especially guilty of this, if you want to put that sort of valence on it. A law firm will get one of these template agreements and then modify it to favor its own clients or its own style of doing things, which may be favorable to the firm or to its clients, but also detracts then from the uniformity and some of the efficiencies that you otherwise gain through having a consensus. All right, so last slide. Oops, there it is. What do we think about the future here? There's been a lot of talk about AI. In a separate project, I and a collaborator are investigating how AI tools are being used in contractual generation, review, and management. Some of those areas have been around for decades. Some are quite new. And one of the issues with all AI-generated output is that what comes out of the AI is coming out of a black box. We don't understand completely what is happening inside of the mechanism. And so our question, our hypothesis is, well, what if AIs or generating, say, M&A agreements for law firms all began with a well-known and identified consensus template that could then be customized based on individual client positions and preferences, but in which those changes were redlined, were identified, so that at least there is a baseline that, in theory, the lawyers who are negotiating this deal all understand. That's a big assumption, I guess, in many cases. But let's assume that at least at each law firm or in each deal team, there's one lawyer who at least understands the content of the agreements that they're producing for their clients. Would this restore trust and transparency in the system and still retain some of the efficiency benefits that we've gotten from both AI generation and also consensus templates? So that is what I have to say. Oops. Thank you very much.